Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this operator training today. We're just going to give folks a few more minutes to get on, so it'll just be another couple of minutes, and then we'll get started with the Q&A. Thank you. All right, folks, thanks again for joining us for this training. Let's go ahead and get started with the Q&A from last week. Here is how you can raise your hand in the participant box. Or if you see right beside where I've circled participants, you can also chat your questions in. And this is questions from any of the previous meetings. So we'll just give folks a chance to chat any questions in. Oh.
All right, I see our first question there. When will guidance for the OGDP map required for the Form 2C and the OGDP hearing application be released? As we keep saying, we are continuing to work on as many guidance documents as we can possibly get out. And they need to get drafted, peer reviewed, final reviewed, and put out there. And so I won't make a promise on a date, but we're working on that one. We know people people want to have that guidance at their fingertips. So as soon as possible. Sorry for not being able to be more specific. And it's also good to know, I will say, and hopefully my audio is better this week. It's also good to know which guidance documents you guys really feel like you need to move forward. That helps us prioritize our work. So we've heard a couple of questions on this one, so we've bumped it up on our list. So appreciate that. Next question that's come in, how will the COGCC treat permits submitted now without having guidance documents to guide permit submittals? We will evaluate the permits against our rules, which is our expectation that operators will be evaluating their permit submittals against our rules and making their best effort at providing accurate and complete information. And if we find that things are not complete and we're unable to review them, then we will ask for more information. I think guidance documents are a tool to help operators. They are not required for operators to proceed with their operations or with their permitting activities. And also I know that some consulting companies have been putting together packages of information, data and information to be submitted, and based on what their read of the rules are. And I think that's an absolutely valuable and appropriate way to be thinking about it. So appreciate that.
All right, it seems like the questions are definitely pretty slow this morning, so we'll go ahead and move on. Give me a moment to pick the train. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
Oh,
there's one.
I have one.
Impacts plan required as an attachment to the Form 2A versus BMP to be included on the Form 2A BMP tab. Justin, can you please provide some clarification on that question, and we'll pick it up. I'm not sure I quite understand. We'll pick that up in one of our, either at the end of the session today or in one of our interim question areas. Thanks.
All right, I'll go ahead and make the transition. Next up, we have Form 2B Part 2 with Stephen Schwartz. All right, Stephen, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Hello again, everyone. I'm Stephen Schwartz, one of the OGLIS here at COGCC, and I'm going to be continuing the discussion of the Form 2B and the interim Form 2B cumulative impacts data identification form. This is part 2, covering the remaining location information sections and the other tabs that talk about the greater OGDP scale information. Next slide, please. So the different location information sections to be covered today will be the water resources, terrestrial and aquatic wildlife resources and ecosystems, and then the 2 emissions section, air resources and public health. From there, we'll go into the OGDP scale information and tab and the beneficial impacts tab, which are both targeted at the whole OGDP scale for the 2B. Next slide, please, Hannah. Just a quick follow-up from our part 1 training from Tuesday, small correction on submitting the interim Form 2B. For e-forms, we do want you to attach the interim Form 2B to the Form 2C in e-forms as an Excel spreadsheet. In the attachments tab of the Form 2C, for the drop-down labels, one of the labels is interim Form 2B, and that's how you'll label it on the Form 2C. Now, regarding the hearing application, this is where the correction comes in. Do state in your OGDP e-filing hearing application that the interim Form 2B is attached to the Form 2C. You will do this instead of providing the Form 2B doc number, which you don't have yet. What we don't want you to do is upload any e-forms, whether it's a 2A, a 2B, an interim 2B, or 2C, with your OGDP e-filing hearing application. So I know I said both last time. This is the correction. All you need to do is state that the 2B is attached to the Form 2C. You don't need to attach the interim Form 2B to your e-filing hearing application. And with that quick note out of the way, next slide, please. Alrighty, so again, as we left off on Tuesday, these are the different sections in the oil and gas location information tab. The sections are grouped by topic. The ones in bold are the ones that will be discussed today. And if you would like more information on the 3 that aren't bolded, which is oil and gas location information, public welfare, or existing oil and gas, please refer to the part 1 interim Form 2B training from January 19th. Next slide, please, Hannah. Okay, so the water resources section. This section starts out with 2 yes/no questions. The first, is this location located in an area, sensitive area for water resources? And is the location within 2,640 feet of a surface water of the state? The answers that you provide here will be cross-checked against the answers submitted on the Form 2A. And if you have an existing location that you are including in this OGDP, we want to make sure that the answers you're giving are applying to the current rules. There were a lot of times during the objective criteria review process, looked at older locations that were not listed as in a sensitive area for water resources, but under further review, they did have the features to qualify them for sensitive area. So just make sure that you're double checking, especially for those existing locations, whether they are or are not in a sensitive area for water resources, and their distance to a surface water of the state. Next questions we ask are about the planned on-location number of storage tanks, and their volume. So this is the number of oil tanks, condensate tanks, produced water, and other tanks and their volumes. And if there are going to be other fluids that don't fit into the oil, condensate, produced water, we just ask that you describe in the additional text box what those others fluids are that are planned to be stored on location and their individual volumes. Next slide, please. So the next part deals with potential impacts. And this is if you have a catastrophic tank failure, where are the fluids going to go and what are they going to be impacting? So the first section is potential impacts to surface water resources. Three features that we're concerned about with these questions are riparian corridors, wetlands, and surface waters of the state. And we're asking three different questions. The distance to those features, the direction from the location, and an evaluation of the baseline condition of those features. Now, again, as Greg covered on Tuesday's presentation, evaluation and description are mean different things. So we're asking for an evaluation. And this evaluation may be done either through field observations, talking to landowners to get a complete answer, or other methods to get an evaluation of that baseline condition of that riparian corridor, wetland, or surface water of the state. The next question asks about potential impacts to public water resources. And for this, we're looking specifically at public water system intakes. And again, we're looking for distance and direction, but instead of a baseline condition, we're asking for an evaluation of the potential impacts of a release getting to these public water system intakes. And a quick note on how we're asking these distance measurements to be handled. We go into a little bit more detail in the what is this section on the interim Form 2B, but these measurements should be along the contaminant pathway to the given feature, not just a straight line measurement. This was something my colleague Doug Andrews also covered on the 2A, that these for water resources, we're not looking for straight line measurements. These should be along the pathways to these different features. Next slide, please, Hannah. Okay, and this next section asks about estimated water usage. And this is the volume in barrels estimated to be used during the drilling and completions operations. Specifically, the volume by the different types of sources. So we're asking the volume of surface water, groundwater, recycled water, or unspecified. Unspecified is just a source that doesn't easily fit into surface, ground, or recycled. And we ask, there's a separate text box that we ask for you to provide a description, not an evaluation, a description of what this unspecified source is. For the recycled water, we've broken this further into two different types. Recycled produced water. This is produced water from oil and gas operations, and recycled non-produced water. So this is reused water that's coming from other non-oil and gas operations. There are lots of different types. So just wanted to differentiate the different types of recycled water. We ask also for what the total volume is planned to be used during drilling and completions, and then the percentage of recycled water. So that's the total recycled divided by total volume times 100 to get a percentage. And we're asking for this as a whole number. And if you get decimals, we're asking you to round to the nearest whole number. So 65.7% would round up to 66%. And finally, we also ask for an evaluation of the measures being taken to reduce the freshwater usage on the location. Next slide, please, Hannah. So now we are getting into the terrestrial and aquatic wildlife resources and ecosystems section. We start out this section by asking you to list all the high priority habitats within 1 mile of the working pad surface. And we're asking three pieces of information. We're asking the high priority habitat name, the distance from the location to that high priority habitat, and if the construction of the location will disturb any high priority habitat acreage, please give the acreage of that high priority habitat that is going to be disturbed. If the location is partially or entirely within a high priority habitat, then that distance is 0 because you're already in the high priority habitat. We also ask for acreage disturbed during construction and interim reclamation. And this question focuses on the location itself. So this is the total disturbance for those two for location and the total disturbed for high priority habitat. Now we understand in certain parts of the state, some of the high priority habitats overlap. For this acreage disturbed during construction and interim reclamation question, we're not asking you to double count those. The section above asks for the different acreages individually, but for this, we're not asking for you to add those together. A 10-acre location that is within overlapping HPHs is still only going to disturb 10 acres. Next slide, please. So for this next section, do we get into the existing land use within 1 mile of the location, but we're not focused on the land use of the location itself. You can see the screenshot from the Form 2B eForms mockup, and you can see the different land use types and the text boxes where you can enter in the existing acreage of each. Some helpful hints in filling this section out. It's helpful to make a map and draw a 1 mile radius around your location. Just as a reminder and reference, a 1 mile radius circle is approximately 2,010 acres. So if we start to see that your total acreage is adding up to 3,000 or 4,000 acres, then we know that there's a data quality bust. If no land use of a given type exists within a mile, simply state 0 existing acres. And if land use is other, we have a separate text box for you to provide a description of what that other is. And if the land use is industrial, we have a separate text box where you can describe what that industrial land use is. While we understand that there are numerous ways of identifying surrounding land use, we stuck with the land use types from the Form 2A that you're most familiar with in order to make it easier to get better answers, not only for this section, but comparing to different parts in the Form 2A. Next slide, please. So for this next section, we are asking specifically if the proposed oil and gas location includes rangeland, forestry, or recreation. Of the disturbed acreage for the location, identify the disturbed acreage of the following plant communities. And so these are the 8 different plant communities. And to note, the amount of plant community disturbed should make sense with the total acreage disturbance of the location itself. We understand that there are some locations where you could have, whole sections of the location that perhaps doesn't have any plant community. So we're only asking for the acreage of disturbed plant community. Next, we ask a text question providing a qualitative evaluation of the incremental adverse impacts to ecosystems from the construction of the location. And finally is the soil resources section. So this again focuses just on the location, and these are the soil map unit names, similar to how you fill out in the Form 2A, but this time we also ask for the acreage disturbed of each of those. Next slide, please, Hannah. Okay, this gets into the first of the 2 emissions sections. This is the air resources section. The pollutants of concern here are oxides of nitrogen, carbon monoxide, VOCs, methane, ethane, CO2, and nitrous oxide. We ask these during the pre-production and production phases, and the equipment lists were derived from the APCD oil and natural gas operations emissions inventory sheets, which are part of the new Reg 7 rules, which have been rolled out, which I'm sure you'll all be starting to get very familiar with. Some of the recommended sources for estimating the emissions of these different pollutants, you can use gas sample or stack testing data from an equivalent site's equipment. AP42 compilation of air emissions factors from the EPA is a fantastic source for lots of different emissions factors for estimating different pieces of equipment. Also, 40 CFR 98 subpart W, which talks about greenhouse gas emissions, also has a nice select list of emissions factors. And finally, lots of manufacturers of different equipment or engines provide data, or there's literature reviews of emissions for different pieces of equipment. I also want to just remind folks that the APCD oil and natural gas operations emissions inventory sheet instructions also contain a ton of additional useful information, and they really go into a lot more of the specific equipment by equipment best references. Next slide, please. So that equipment is primarily stationary. In the cumulative impact rules, another piece is the mobile sources of emissions. For these, we're asking for diesel vehicle road miles. These are seen as the largest mobile sources of emissions, and as emission sources that are uniquely related to oil and gas. For here, we're looking at different stages of operation: construction, drilling, completions, interim reclamation, and production. And we're not looking for personal diesel vehicles. These are the large trucks used for primarily mobilization and demobilization of equipment to and from the site, and for the delivery of materials and supplies. Different possible sources of information that we recommend: lots of contractors include mileage as a line item in their invoices, or they'll charge by fuel use by the mile, or they will identify the mileage traveled in their end of operation activity reports. So you may need to reach out to different other business units within your organizations to get this information. Next slide, please, Hannah. So the public health section, the pollutants here are specifically the hazardous air pollutants. These are your benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylenes, N-hexane, 2,2,4 trimethylpentane, hydrogen sulfide, formaldehyde, and methanol. We're working on guidance with APCD. We wanted to remind you to be sure that the emission estimation, especially for these, the estimation method being used is appropriate for the different types of equipment. And APCD provided a few examples to us. Storage tanks, the best estimation methods are samples from equivalent sites, equipment, or default emission factors in their PS memo 0501. Separators, samples from equivalent equipment or known emission factors are best. For load-out emissions, default emission factors are located in their PS memo 1402. And non-road internal combustion engines, the engine manufacturers usually have a lot of great information. Again, that AP42 lists of documents from the EPA or other APCD published emissions factors. Other general sources to use, again, AP24 compilation of air emissions factors from the EPA has a ton of great information. Manufacturers tend to have a lot of this data on hand. You just have to ask for it. And finally, APCD does have a lot of memos and a lot of guidance with what they have approved as different emission calculation methodologies. So please use them and their websites as a great resource for estimating the emissions of these different pollutants. Next slide, please. We then ask two qualitative evaluation questions. These are asking about the potential acute, chronic, short-term or long-term incremental impacts to public health as a result of the pre-production emissions and the production emissions. Those are two separate questions. And again, this is an evaluation, not a description. And then finally, we talk about the dust impacts. And these are in two parts. There's vehicle trips on a monthly and annual or total basis. And these are for the different stages: construction, drilling, completions, interim reclamation, and production. We understand that some of these activities do not take place over the course of more than a year. So instead of the annual number, you would just give the total, and that's why that's annual or total. And then the final section under dust impacts talks about impacts from proppant. So we're asking the estimated pounds of proppant to be used during completions, what the different types are. And if you're familiar with filling out the Form 5A, that's sort of what we are viewing as the after activity report for those. But we're also asking here on the Form 2B for an evaluation of the proppant management system being used. How effectively is it preventing different amounts of silica dust from traveling off location or being prevented from traveling off location? Next slide, please, Hannah. So that covers all of the different location information sections on the location information tab on the Form 2B. These next two tabs talk about OGDP scale information as well as the OGDP scale beneficial impacts from the activities. Next slide, please. So for the OGDP scale, we're looking at all the high priority habitats estimated to be disturbed via the construction of new roads, including access roads, pipelines, and utilities for this OGDP. This is familiar but different from the location information that talked about just the location disturbance. Here, since we recognize that roads, pipelines, and utilities tend to serve multiple locations within a single OGDP, we've kept this at the OGDP scale. Here we're asking for the name of the high priority habitat and the amount of acreage disturbed of that high priority habitat for any of those activities. We also ask for the total acreage disturbed during the construction and interim reclamation for the total acreage disturbed and high priority habitat acreage disturbed for the construction of new roads, including access roads, pipelines, and utilities for this OGDP. Again, this is construction and interim reclamation. And again, if there are overlapping high priority habitats, don't double count them. We've already identified in that section above which high priority habitats have what amounts of disturbance. And then finally, we're asking the number of miles of existing lease road planned to be used. This is giving us an idea of the existing baseline condition of the miles of road and how many miles of road construction was prevented by the use of these existing access roads. Next slide, please, Hannah. So for the beneficial impacts, this is broken up into three general questions. The first is asking about equipment and facility removal. This is where we're asking the number of wells to be plugged and abandoned due to the activities of this OGDP. We're also asking about the number of locations, pits, and tanks estimated to be closed or removed through the activities in this OGDP. And if there are locations that are planned to be removed or closed, we're asking for what is the acres to be reclaimed through the final reclamation of those locations. Also asking the number of truck trips to be avoided due to those facility closures. These next two sections are more open-ended and ask for qualitative evaluation of beneficial impacts to two different groups. The first question is asking for the beneficial impacts to the surrounding community. So these are the focus on the surrounding impact, on the beneficial impacts to people primarily. And the second question asks beneficial impacts to the surrounding wildlife and ecosystems. We wanted to separate these two rather than bunch them together, since a lot of different operators focus a lot of their beneficial impact activities in sort of these two categories, one or the other or both. So we've grouped them separately. Next slide, please, Hannah. Just a quick note on required data fields. In the what is this section of the interim Form 2B column, many of the data fields are labeled as required. And I just wanted to explain this a little bit more clearly. Required means an answer needs to be provided. That answer could be 0, it could be none, it could be not applicable, or it could be, if the answer does apply to you, you would give the answer there. We're simply saying that the field may not be blank if it's listed as required. Optional data fields, on the other hand, may be left blank or filled in as the operator needs. So I just wanted to make sure I was clarifying that a little bit. Next slide, please, Hannah. So the interim Form 2B was released on Tuesday. It is located under SB 19181, Mission Change Guidance. And if you scroll down, you have the Form 2B presentations, as well as the interim Form 2B spreadsheet itself. Additionally, I also want to point out that the interim Form 2B is also located on the website under Regulation Forms, and it is under the Form 2B template section. It is also under the Form 2C template section, as we are asking you to attach it to the Form 2C in eForms. I also want to take a moment to remind everyone to submit your questions through the Ask a Question portal on the Mission Change Guidance. While we understand that there are some site-specific questions, and we do want you to go directly to the contacts for those, we are getting a lot of general questions that the rest of the community would benefit from. So asking the question so that everyone can view that question and answer later is a really powerful tool for everyone to use. So we just want to encourage you to use that. And finally, just as a reminder, this Mission Change Guidance page is updated continuously as we finish guidance documents. We don't have a set time, as that's the only time of the day that we can release things. We release them as we get final peer review and approval of things. So please check back regularly. Myself and other contacts have received a lot of emails asking when different forms or guidance will be posted. And a lot of times it had been posted a day or two earlier. So please check back here as it is updated often. Next slide, please. Hannah, thank you. And so this concludes the Form 2B Part 2 training. Again, the Part 1 is from January 19th. And if there are other topics that we find over time that require further guidance, we will set up other trainings at different operator meetings later on in the weeks to come. So thank you very much.
Great job, Stephen. Thank you so much for that. It looks like there's some questions, so I'm sure Greg will take the lead with those.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Stephen. Great job with that presentation. And yeah, Stephen, there are a number of questions that came in. Before we move to the questions directly to your presentation, I do want to jump back to that question that was asked right at the end of the previous period. And we've had a chance to think about that. And so I will get to that. So how do we differentiate the mitigation measures needed for the Form 2B mitigations tab versus the cumulative impacts plan required as an attachment to the Form 2A versus BMP to be included on the Form 2A BMP tab? And yeah, we are definitely drawing a distinction between those three areas. So mitigation measures on the Form 2B mitigation tab will include the measures that can reduce or compensate adverse impacts anywhere in the OGDP area. This is larger scale than the information provided on the Form 2A. It should include mitigating impacts from access roads, utilities, pipeline flow lines, etc., and mitigating impacts to possible receptors throughout the OGDP area. An example I'd throw out is, you may be looking on a Form 2A at the impacts from truck traffic driving onto the site on the access road, and you may have a house that would be sensitive to the truck lights coming into their living room from a situation like that. On the OGDP level, you might be driving through a community on your haul route, and working with the local government, the municipality of that community, to how you manage your traffic on the OGDP scale would be something more appropriate there. On the Form 2A BMP tab, you will provide avoidance measures and minimization measures. So we're really looking at how your Form 2A planning avoided impacts first and then minimized impacts. So measures that will be used at a particular location, sound walls to minimize noise impact, line containment to minimize the risk of groundwater contamination, things like that. And then lastly, on the Form 2A cumulative impacts plan, which is an attachment to the Form 2A, that you'll provide a plan that describes the continued minimization and mitigation of impacts over the lifetime of that location, and at all different phases of operation. So how you will mitigate long-term cumulative impacts over time. An example might be planting trees or shrubs along the perimeter. It won't mitigate impacts initially, so those won't necessarily have a positive effect during the drilling and completion, but over the long term of the life of the well, those trees grow up and block the view of the tank battery and whatnot. And so there is definitely some overlap between the BMPs and the cumulative impact plan attachment. But the BMPs should focus on the operational actions undertaken on the location, and the cumulative impacts plan should speak to the larger plan of mitigation at the location over time. So that question definitely had a lot to it. Stephen mentioned our Q&A portal, and I will admit that many of the blanks on that sheet are mine. I'm behind on answering questions. And this one will certainly make a good question to put up there, because that's a pretty in-depth answer. So thanks for that. Stephen, we're moving back to you. So do they have to include the draft HPH areas on the 2B? And I'll actually, I'll take this one, Stephen, because the HPH layers on the COGCC GIS online interactive map are those that were finalized and adopted by the commission. So those are the high priority habitat maps, and Taylor Elm from CPW and I will be talking about those in a little bit. CPW is also providing on their own website a link to their updated high priority habitat data, so that they are making available updated planning information that anyone can have access to for planning purposes, as those habitat maps may change and will be updated only annually by COGCC. And then COGCC will also provide a link to that information on our downloads page on our website. So that'll be available there. So then the next question we got is, for the acreage calculation within high priority habitat, do you only consider the working pad surface, or is the road, pipeline, and everything else also included in that calculation? Stephen?
So the answer to this is depending on what tab you're talking about. So for the location information tab, this is only calculated for that location or working pad surface. While on the OGDP scale information tab, that is where we're looking to capture the road, pipeline, etc. information. So we do want you to make sure that you're putting the appropriate information on the appropriate tabs of the form.
So yeah, read those questions carefully on each tab, and I think it will be clear as you're filling out that data. Land uses and high priority habitat are asked to be identified within a mile high priority habitat is measured from the working pad surface, and land use measured from the location. Is there a reason to measure one from location and one from working pad surface? Generally, we've tried to be consistent in the way we've asked those questions with what the rules guided us to, to collect the information. And I would say also typically working pad surface has been our sort of default, if you will, measuring point. But in many cases, the location is more the source of disturbance. And in the case of wildlife response, wildlife and habitat impacts, the entire location disturbance is a little more appropriate. Please give examples of non-produced oil and gas recycled water. Thanks. This could be like gray water from a municipality that they're looking to sell for other industrial purposes. This could be industrial process water that's been recycled into use for oil and gas development. But basically, it's providing a place for other sources of water that would offset freshwater consumption. And then please confirm pipelines as defined by the rules for estimated disturbance. Not all pipelines fall under COGCC definition of pipelines. Stephen, you want to take that?
So pipeline means flow line, crude oil transfer line, or gathering line as defined for these rules, for these questions. Greg, do you have anything else you want to add to that, or I think?
No, I think the definition is pretty clear. So those are the pipelines that we're talking about. And I think this next question kind of follows on that. Utilities will more than likely be permitted and installed by a third party, not the operator. If the third party utility company ultimately constructs the utility in a different location or alignment, and therefore potentially impacts different high priority habitat that doesn't match what was identified by the operator on the Form 2B, will the operator be held responsible?
So operators will not be held responsible for changes a third party makes to their utility or larger scale pipeline plan after the operator's permit has been approved. As I discussed in the middle of the Part 1 training on Tuesday, the Form 2B is intended as an estimate of impacts at the time of submittal, prior to the actual work being performed. It is not meant to be a reporting tool. So if changes are decided upon by third parties after approval, then we have the estimation that you felt was your best understanding at the time of submittal. And that is not something we're looking to enforce on.
There's a follow-up question. In addition to third-party utilities, the same scenario would apply to third-party. Would the same scenario apply to third-party gathering lines or other midstream services as well? Yes. COGCC only has regulatory authority over those entities that we have regulatory authority over. And so it didn't mean to make Stephen spit out his coffee there. So, we recognize that you're engaged in contract negotiations that sometimes are not finalized by the time an application is submitted. If it materially affects a submittal, then yes, our expectation would be that you would come back to us and maybe bring that to our attention through a Form 4 sundry or something. But so that our inspectors don't go out and expect to see one thing and find something completely different. That gets challenging for us. So the more, the better informed your permitting can be, and the better informed your follow-up can be, the better. more redundancy for me. Sorry about that. Hannah, I'm not seeing any other questions come in. Appreciate that. Those were good questions. Some good in-depth questions there.
All right, thank you so much, guys, for answering those questions. Next up is Greg with the wildlife map overview, and he's going to be driving. So Greg, I just stopped sharing my screen. You should be able to share yours now since I made you a co-host.
All right, and I will share this screen. And would you please make Taylor Elm a co-host as well and bring him up into the panel?
Yes, absolutely.
And can you confirm that you can see the COGCC website and it is on the maps page?
Yep, I can confirm that.
Thank
you, Greg.
All right. Well, good morning, and thanks everyone for tuning in again. Today, my colleague Taylor Elm and I will be walking through a demo of the COGCC GIS online interactive map to show off the high priority habitat layers and describe how they can be used to implement the mitigation hierarchy. Taylor Elm is the Northwest Energy Liaison for CPW. He's been engaged in the consultation process as a land use specialist and an energy liaison in the Piceance, Sandwash, and North Park basins for the last 8 years. So a known partner to many of you in your wildlife consultations. The high priority map layers have been available for review on our interactive map since August 6, 2020. And they do represent a departure from the previous sensitive wildlife habitat and restricted surface occupancy maps. As we published these on January 15th or finalized them on January 15th, the names of some of the groups of HPH layers were changed from what they were listed when they were, in draft for consideration. But otherwise, these maps are the habitat maps that were reviewed, discussed, and adopted by the commission. So there hasn't been, any changes to what the commission considered and adopted. So I'm going to go to the map here, and as you all know, click on maps. You'll get to the GIS online, and then you'll click here to access the interactive map. I'm going to remind you just of the 3 categories of the high priority habitat, and they're listed under the Parks and Wildlife layer. And I'll also note that, there's some other things here that are helpful. Finding out who the energy liaison in your area is, you can click here. Finding out where state parks, state trust lands, and state wildlife areas, which have now been included into the areas to avoid for habitat. Areas that are subject to an existing wildlife management plan are shown. Black bear habitat, where there are rules for trash management, are shown. And then here are the lists of the high priority habitat. So the first is the habitat that's considered the no surface occupancy, the 1202C layers. And so, there's these are not in the same order that they appear A through S in the rules, but they're actually in alphabetical order. So I'm not sure what's better there, and would be glad to take your feedback on that. The next layer is the high priority habitat, where density of oil and gas development triggers an evaluation of the need for compensatory mitigation. So these are the 1202D density habitats listed here. And as is typical and as has been in the past, each individual layer gets a different color. I'm colorblind, so I'll probably get those messed up if I really try and talk about them. And then the last are high priority habitat that isn't included in the above categories. So these habitats aren't explicitly called out in or listed in the 1200 series rules, but they are subject to 309E1 consultation. And so these are listed here and include, the broader areas around, raptor nests, the roosting areas for raptors, general habitat management for grouse, and sort of those connective areas for other ground dwelling birds. So as adopted, these rules actively encourage pre-consultation with CPW when locations are still in the planning phase and significant permitting investments have not yet been made. And at any time, I encourage you to reach out to the energy liaison for your development area and proactively discuss your project plans, and reach out to the oil and gas location assessment specialist team, whether that's regionally assigned or not. Start engaging CPW and COGCC early in the process. So the first thing that Taylor and I are going to discuss is the various aquatics habitats. And as you can see in the notes here with these aquatic habitats, they are kind of slow to load on the map. So I'm actually going to step away from the online demonstration and walk through a PowerPoint slide. We'll see how this works. Have I now switched over to a PowerPoint slide? Excellent. And now I've got it in a slideshow. So thanks for the thumbs up, Stephen. I guess I'm learning on the fly. So so again, we'll just start with statewide view where we were just looking. And if you turn on all the aquatics, it shows that these waters occur, over the entire state, and in some cases create pretty dense coverage. But bear in mind, at this scale, these are only 500 feet from the ordinary high water mark, so 1,000 feet across. And at this scale, it looks like some areas are completely covered. But those most dense areas, like the ones highlighted in yellow here, are typically the cutthroat trout designated crucial habitat. And those were previously included under the restricted surface occupancy designation. And in fact, if we just look at the cutthroat trout habitat, these layers did not change significantly from the prior version of the rules. Now we're going to go ahead and zoom in on an area of the Piceance Basin. And we're going to look at all the aquatic layers again. And you can see here when we zoom in, there's far more space between, between those NSO areas than there is covered by the NSO areas. And that even holds true in those more dense cutthroat trout areas. We're going to zoom in again. And so here we've got the aquatics turned on, as well as roads and rivers. So I'd just like to note that in my presentation, when I was putting this together last evening, there is no transparency in these layers, and that is a little bit problematic as a management tool. And so I reached out to our GIS Army of One, Chris Eisinger, and he jumped on that issue. And sometime between 6:30 last evening and the first thing this morning, he made the change so that now all of the layers have a 50% transparency. So you can actually see the ground surface and other features below. So my presentation may be a little bit clunky because it still has the layers with zero transparency. So this pale blue layer, I believe, is sport fish management. And obviously, since this is a aquatics habitat, in addition to this stream here, there is certainly a stream here, a stream here, and a stream here. And this is typical of the geography of this area. So going to the next slide, if we turn on the aerial photos, we can see long linear ridges with valleys between them. that's typical of this region. And so now we'll turn off the layers so we can see beneath them, and we can see that this valley is fairly steeply incised by this stream. And if we zoom in a little bit closer, even we can see that there's you know, a road going up the valley. There's actually an oil and gas location down here in the southwest in the valley, so that would be covered in that habitat area. And there's an intermittent stream feature, and we can see from the aerial image that stream feature is likely not continuous as the blue line here would represent. And in fact, when we look at the USGS quad, you can also see that it's the dash dot 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 dash dot 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 of a intermittent stream. And so the topo map also, you know, accentuates that there's a relatively flat area in that channel bottom, and steep canyon walls, and then fairly narrow ridges before it goes down to the next canyon in this area. So as the operator of the location down here determined, the overall impacts may be far smaller from a well-designed location in the valley bottom, rather than a location with steep access road up and out of the valley and significant cut and fill on the sides or tops of a ridge. So the commission considered situations like this in its rulemaking and provided practical and protective pathway to development in areas like this. So sport fish management waters are Rule 1202C1S, and under the consultation rule of 309E5 big D, I believe Romanet 2 little b, as applicable to intermittent streams, intermittent and ephemeral streams, CPW may waive and the director may grant an exception to the no surface occupancy provision. So that waiver and exception would be subject to certain site design and operation provisions, you know, such as making sure that the site is, you know, adequately constructed with appropriate secondary containment structures, adequately inspected, you know, on a daily basis, so that you know, if any spills occur, they don't affect that resource. And there's a few other I don't have them all at my fingertips. So and in addition, you know, they said, well, maybe this area would be really remote and hard to inspect daily in the winter. So can we have a alternative to daily inspections of maybe automatic site shut-in or something like that with some remote monitoring? And so that's also an option. And so the waiver could be, you know, that waiver could be obtained from CPW during pre-consultation, and it would be submitted with the Form 2A, or it could be obtained during the consultation period. But absent that waiver, the only option would be a variance request. So that's where early engagement with CPW and COGCC is really crucial. So now I'm going to go ahead and try and return to our maps. And it's always really risky to do a live website demo. And so we're going to double down on that. And Taylor is going to join us, and he's going to even talk me through. I'll drive the maps, and he'll kind of talk us through the next section here. So Taylor, are you ready to go?
Sure. Thanks, Greg. Assuming you can hear me. Yeah, thanks for the intro. Thanks for driving the ship here. And thought it would be helpful to run through one, maybe two, time permitting. Greg, cut us off if we have to. Kind of examples of areas, and turn on some of these layers and talk through it from a CPW perspective, kind of how we would look at these different layers and different categories as we were looking at a new location, either during the pre-consultation or official consultation stage, and having some of these discussions that Greg mentioned. So first area, Greg, if we could zoom to 8 North 80 West. Take a look at this township. This area is in Jackson County, an area of North Park, Colorado, along Highway 14, just south of Walden. And this area is really a rich area for wildlife. We have various species, greater sage grouse, several big game species, including moose, pronghorn, elk, and deer, waterfowl, a really rich area for aquatic species and for sport fishing. And so, you know, it's an area that came to mind for me to kind of take a look at, because given all the wildlife values in the area, we've also been working very closely with an oil and gas operator in this area over the last handful of years to effectively develop the resource in this area while also avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating impacts to wildlife. So given that this area does contain a pretty robust population of greater sage grouse, I thought it might be a good example to walk through as a species that actually has habitats within all three of these categories that Greg pointed out earlier. So first off in that list, yeah, Greg, if you could turn on that 1202C habitat for greater sage grouse. Not a surprise to many, these are those LEC areas. And you can see kind of how that shows up in this given landscape. These are within those 1202C NSO category because these are kind of considered for this species that highest priority, most valuable area for the species. They select these areas because they literally are the greatest or most important habitat on the landscape for nesting, for brood rearing, which is often a limiting factor for these species. So from a planning perspective, you can kind of see how that lays out, these no surface occupancy areas and areas that we consider kind of really important to avoid. We do not have a good mechanism for most of these 1202C categories to mitigate impacts within these. So avoidance is really kind of that first measure from our standpoint. Going forward from there, kind of in that hierarchy, for sage grouse at least, under 1202D, we have these priority habitat management areas. And you can see these are kind of a modeled habitat layer indicating these, as the name suggests, the highest priority areas for this species. And this takes into account, you know, other seasonal habitats, high priority winter areas, as long as breeding, nesting. So you get a feel kind of for how that lays across this landscape. Implications for this one, as Greg mentioned, are a few things regarding consultation with CPW. First thing probably to note is that you'll be looking at compensatory mitigation for the direct impacts under Rule 1203. Secondary, from CPW standpoint, we're going to want to take a look at what the existing density of oil and gas locations look like around the proposed development, how the addition of some proposed locations or a single location may affect that density. For these habitats under 1202D, as we've taken a look at those over time and done our research, a lot of the literature and the studies out there suggest that density of development, including oil and gas, roads, even recreational trails and development, really has the potential to affect these species within these habitats. And so we'll actually, after this, kind of briefly go through how CPW kind of looks at density of facilities and talk about that in a little bit more detail and possibly next week as well. But that would be kind of the next factor. And then based on those density assessments, we would be looking at you know, a wildlife mitigation plan that may or may not consider some discussions and considerations on compensatory mitigation for the indirect impacts from the proposed development. So outside of those two, then we bump down to these other categories, as Greg mentioned. For sage grouse, we have general habitat management areas, and then also this undesignated habitat category. So you can see that proceeds to fill in the rest of that landscape. So, really that means from a rule perspective, anywhere in here is going to trigger a consultation with CPW. It just depends on which category you're in of kind of how those conversations are going to take place and what might be involved. So in these 309E1 habitats, that consultation is really going to consist more of best management practices, things like timing of the construction and drilling operations, truck traffic and lighting and noise, and how we can really minimize impacts versus discussions on density and compensatory mitigation and avoidance of those areas. So hopefully that's somewhat helpful as an example, just to run through with a given species and kind of see how those different categories play out and things that you'll have to consider that we would be looking at during the consultation stage for proposed developments in these various areas. And Greg, I don't know if you had anything to add on this one, if you wanted to jump down to the other one we had discussed where there was kind of that recently proposed location.
Yeah, before we leave this area, Taylor, I'd just, point out, something else that, okay, we've talked entirely about sage grouse. This area is obviously, a really rich wildlife area in the state anyway. So if we turn on other layers, as you mentioned right off the bat, I mean, we can find habitats in there for, aquatic species, elk, mule deer, pronghorn, perhaps. And so, as those things layer on, again, it really emphasizes the importance of, seeing all of those different layers and starting to think about how your operations can be managed, in those areas of important habitat, and, engaging CPW in sort of that location siting right off the bat. So again, bear in mind that locations within high priority habitats do trigger an alternative location analysis. And so, we really want to make sure that, if you start to layer a few different species on there, that we're considering, the interactions of those species, the overall habitat degradation, and, finding the best location within those areas that are managed for wildlife protection. So with that, Taylor, I'll turn off these layers maybe, and we can pop down to the other area. Can you direct me there?
I can. Let's try a 7 south, 93 west.
So we're staying over on the west slope here. Looks like we're south of I-70.
Yep, that's right. Just south of Rifle, Colorado.
All right.
I think we were in around section 17.
How's that look?
That looks good.
I can start with wildlife layers, or I can start with location layers.
Let's start with that location layer. This was a recent location that CPW actually was involved in a consultation, and we thought it was fairly representative here to kind of run through as well. Should be familiar to a couple of you on the call here. This location is in an area obviously with some existing development, existing access road kind of into there. And as Greg does start maybe going ahead and turning on some wildlife layers, we can kind of look at that.
I think we had aquatics in here.
Yep. And this is one where in this instance, there's some access road bisecting some of these aquatic habitats. This was cutthroat trout in this instance. Thought it was important to note as you take a look at some of those aquatic habitats that they are a little bit unique from some of the other 1202C habitats in how access roads and pipeline corridors are treated in there, and there's a little bit more flexibility with those. So keep that in mind as you kind of look at some of those aquatic NSO habitats with regards to access. And for this one, you know, where the aquatic NSO habitat what comes through and it bisected that access road, it's an existing access road. So really in CPW's standpoint here, in my opinion, this comes down to kind of as Greg described in those aquatic slides. We're going to be talking more things like best management practices in consultation, and likely the NSO restriction is not applicable in this situation. You know, the other thing, Greg, on the 1202D, this area was very close to some big game winter range designations. You can see it fell just outside of those mapped habitats, and thought this was interesting. You know, I'm not sure an ALA necessarily was performed on this location, but you can see that just a slight shift in that pad location really could you know, get it out of that habitat and kind of change the conversation and the consultation with us, and kind of create a better all situation. So I thought it was a good representation of the value of maybe taking a look at that ALA process and just seeing if there's an opportunity that we can bump things around a little bit and maybe still be able to access those minerals, but minimize some of those impacts on wildlife a little bit.
And Taylor, I think I would maybe look at this location here in section 16 as one that, you know, had the operator moved that location up into section 17, perhaps they could have reached all of those same bottom holes, yet kept the location and its associated access road out of that habitat. So, you know, I think again, that's exploring early on. And I think you mentioned also to me that the access road, rather than coming up through this cutthroat trout habitat, the operator stayed down in the valley bottom and then proposed their road to connect from this location to the west in section 18. So, you know, not only keeping their surface location out, but trying to minimize the access road that goes through that habitat as well.
Yeah.
Any other features we want to walk through on the website, or did you want to move to the couple other graphics you had?
We can move on unless I'm missing anything that you want to hit on.
No, I think that's good. I imagine we'll get some questions. So going back to a PowerPoint. Let's get back to this.
All right, so I mentioned in those 1202D habitats, this consideration about oil and gas location densities. Bear with me as I explain here. For Rule 1202D, in our mind, kind of the first assessment within those habitats when we're looking at densities, per the rule language in 1202D, is to see if the location is going to exceed that density of one oil and gas location per square mile, or you know, if it's in an area that is already exceeding that one per square mile. So methodology, and I think there'll be more to come on this as far as guidance. Greg can correct me if I'm wrong, but should be coming out and being released. Methodology for this consists basically of measuring from your proposed location 1.12 miles and seeing if there are any existing active oil and gas locations within that distance. Now, you might be saying 1.12 miles sounds a little strange. What's up with that distance? As you can see in this diagram, a buffer from a location of 0.56 miles results in an area surrounding that location being 1 square mile. So that's kind of the unit that we started with. And you can see in this instance, these two hypothetical locations, that their zone around them, their area of 1 square mile, is intersecting in the middle there. That overlapping portion results in that area, that portion of habitat, exceeding the density of 1 location per square mile. So in CPWs, from our perception or our viewpoint, that portion of that habitat has exceeded that 1 location per square mile and would trigger under 1202D the need for a CPW approved wildlife mitigation plan, where we may talk about how can we offset some of those impacts from those direct or indirect impacts of the proposed development. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. We may touch on that a little bit more next Thursday. And like I said, should be some guidance coming out on this of how to look at this. Next slide, I guess, Greg. The other section in the rules that you'll notice that mention density of oil and gas locations is under 1203D. And this is the rule that talks about compensatory mitigation for indirect impacts. And this basically provides the upper limit or threshold for where CPW no longer would really consider mitigation for indirect impacts. As I mentioned, kind of the literature review suggests that after you are exceeding this greater than 5 locations per square mile, the indirect impacts are pretty prevalent, and trying to discern additional indirect impacts in these areas or measure those becomes pretty difficult. And so we're basically saying that at this level, we're no longer really going to assess those indirect impacts. It is important to note that in these areas, there's still going to be animals that are using these areas. They're still used by habitat by animals. There's a certain proportion of a population that can either habituate to that disturbance, or they may just have nowhere else to go, and they're still forced into these areas. So we would still consider the direct compensatory mitigation in these areas, but the indirect impacts are no longer measurable or discernible in these areas. So as far as methodology for this one, it's a little bit different in the proposal, in that we've proposed running a GIS tool called a point density analysis, and basically generating a GIS layer that shows these areas where the density per square mile has already exceeded 5 locations. And then I believe the intent is to provide this layer as a reference to operators to essentially know that within these areas that density has already been exceeded, and we will not worry as much about those indirect impact mitigation discussions. So hopefully that's somewhat helpful. I'm sure that sparks some more questions as well.
Yeah, thanks. And to confirm, yes, we are working towards getting this tool up on our website. But again, our GIS Army of One is pretty busy. So I believe that concludes our portion of the presentation here. So I am going to stop sharing, and then we will start into questions. Let's see, it looks like the first question is, since the new layers include far more lands than previous versions and will require many more CPW consults and encourage many more pre-application consultations. Do you know if CPW has or will increase staff for the potential many additional needed consultations?
Yep, so good question. We do anticipate adding one additional FTE to CPW to help with the additional workload. And additionally, I think it's important to note that internally, we can always kind of reshuffle and reassign staff as needed to help meet demands, especially as permitting fluctuates kind of up and down.
And also the consultation period is 60 days, which will allow a little bit more flexibility. And I would also encourage operators again to reach out early. If we can engage in pre-application consultation, then oftentimes the actual effective, the formal consultation period in the permit process can be reduced. Thank you for the transparency, Ad. Much appreciated. Yeah, sorry about that. Wish we'd seen that right away, but that makes a big difference. And so was really grateful for Chris Eisinger and his work. So if there's somebody that you want to buy lunch for, that's the guy right there. Next question: each of the three restricted density and consultation spatial data sets available for download on the COGCC site are still labeled as draft, and are these the most up-to-date data sets? Will these data sets be further updated and not labeled as draft? I apologize about that. I did not realize that, so I will check in with Chris and make sure that those are what was pushed out on August 6th should still be the layers that we are dealing with. And I'll make sure that those data sets are appropriate and labeled as final. So sorry about that, and thanks for pointing that out. Let's see. How do the COGCC mapped HPH layers compare with the newly updated CPW HPH layers? So Taylor, that's for you.
Yeah, so they should generally be the same. There were some minor updates to CPW's layers for Raptors and Lex that occurred after the commission hearings for the new rules. There will be some minor differences until that first opportunity that COGCC's maps are updated through rulemaking, and then those internal changes that we make as far as keeping our HPH layers current would possibly be incorporated at that time during that rulemaking.
Great. Whoops. Okay, so CPW staff will play a much larger role in determining siting of oil and gas locations than previously. Is CPW staff getting training to ensure a more consistent application of these rules to the extent consistency is possible and appropriate, understanding that sites have site-specific aspects? If training is ongoing, can operators participate to ensure we achieve success and compliance? Taylor?
Yeah, that is a great question. We try to do kind of ongoing training with our energy staff and our land use staff. Obviously, we've seen the need to for some of our field staff that has not been involved as much as our energy and land use staff. We know we're going to have to do some internal training and get folks up to speed. Doing the combined training with operators is not something we've typically done in the past, but I definitely think that would be something we could do going forward, and is a pretty interesting idea.
Thanks. Could you discuss how it came to be the new layers include far more lands than previous versions? And I would just start that answer off. We might need a little more clarity, but these layers were certainly addressed in the rulemaking, and I believe many of the stakeholders brought in tables that showed the different land areas, and that was discussed in the rulemaking. But I don't know if you want to add any clarity to that, Taylor.
No, I think that's a good point on those tables that kind of outline increases and in some cases decreases, but yeah, overall they did increase.
I mean, generally, I think these map layers track what you've been using to manage wildlife and impacts to wildlife for all development. As long as I've been at the commission since 2010,
Yeah, that is true. Our original high priority habitat list is what CPW uses for all land use reviews and consultations. And during the hearings, we provided that high priority habitat list as the mechanism, and that is what the COGCC Commission opted to include during the 181 rulemakings.
For the 2A wildlife habitat map exhibit, should only the 3 HPH designations be identified if present, or should particular species be identified? And from my perspective, we're on the 2A, we're looking for specific species. So we would want to see where those species overlap, and certainly that's available on our website. But yeah, that is what we're looking for. In density habitats where vertical wells are drilled, how is development supposed to occur if there is only to be one location per square mile? And from my, the density determinations do not preclude development. Development can occur at higher densities. It just, that's where those species listed in 1202D, where mitigation for the impacts is appropriate. And if you have anything to add to that, Taylor.
No, I would agree with that. It's not a precluding it, just saying that, as I described earlier, that higher density has been determined to have greater effects that we feel like we need to offset those.
Right. Okay. How are we doing, Hannah? It looks like the flow of questions is slowing down.
Okay, awesome. Let me just share my screen.
Thank you, Taylor, by the way.
Agenda. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Taylor and Greg, for the great presentation. That was very informative. And thank you, everybody, for being a part of this training today. If you have additional questions, we still have the portal on our website. If anybody needs me to navigate to that, I can show you how to get to that. Or you can save them till next time. We'll be doing a question and answer again, first thing at the next meeting on Tuesday, the 26th. And with that, thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you all. Thanks, Hannah.
Oh, thank you. Bye-bye.